The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone path as William approached the weathered oak door of the old cottage. His heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that he hadn't felt in years. Kate walked beside him, her hand gently clasped in his, both of them staring at the brass nameplate that read Thornfield Cottage, Eastern 1892. This wasn't just any ordinary house visit. 3 weeks earlier, William had received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Henderson, a solicitor from the small town of Millbrook, nearly 200 miles from where William and Kate lived. In their comfortable suburban home, Margaret had explained that William's great-uncle Arthur, a man he had only heard mentioned in hushed family conversations, had passed away at the age of 93 and left him something unexpected in his will. William had never met Uncle Arthur personally. The family had always spoken of him as the mysterious relative who had disappeared from their lives decades ago after some sort of falling out with William's grandfather. All William knew was that Arthur had been a scholar of some sort, possibly a historian, and had lived alone in this remote cottage for the better part of 40 years. The inheritance was simple enough. Arthur had left William the cottage and all its contents. Margaret had been quite specific about that last part. Everything inside was to remain exactly as Arthur had left it until William could come and decide what to do with it all. She had mentioned that Arthur had been very particular about this arrangement, insisting that William must be the first person to enter the cottage after his passing. Kate squeezed William's hand reassuringly as he fumbled with the heavy iron key that Margaret had given them the night before when they checked into the local inn. The key was old-fashioned, ornate, and felt substantial in his palm. As he slid it into the lock, he could feel the mechanism was well maintained despite the cottage's obvious age. "Are you ready for this?" Kate asked softly, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. They had been married for 8 years, and she knew William well enough to recognize when he was wrestling with something deeper than surface nerves. William nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for anything. The drive up from London had been filled with speculation about what they might find. Would it be a hoarder's paradise filled with decades of accumulated junk? Would there be valuable antiques, family photographs that might fill in the gaps of William's family history? Or would it simply be the modest possessions of an elderly man who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life? The lock clicked open with surprising ease, and William felt a slight resistance as he pushed against the heavy door. It opened slowly, revealing a narrow hallway that stretched toward what appeared to be a sitting room. The air that greeted them was neither stale nor musty as they had expected, but instead carried a faint scent of old books, leather, and something else, something that reminded William inexplicably of his childhood, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Kate stepped in behind him, and they both paused to let their eyes adjust to the dimmer light inside. The hallway was lined with dark wood paneling, and several framed photographs hung along the walls, though they couldn't make out the details from where they stood. A narrow staircase led to what was presumably a second floor, and doorways opened off to both sides of the corridor. "It's beautiful," Kate whispered, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the banister. "Look at this craftsmanship. They don't make houses like this anymore." William nodded absently, but his attention was already being drawn toward the sitting room at the end of the hall. Through the open doorway, he could see towering bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling, packed with what appeared to be thousands of volumes. A large desk sat near a window, and he could just make out papers scattered across its surface, as if someone had been working there recently. As they walked deeper into the cottage, William began to notice details that surprised him. Despite being 93 when he died, Uncle Arthur had clearly been maintaining the house meticulously. There was no dust on the surfaces, no signs of neglect or decline. Everything appeared to be in perfect order, as if Arthur had simply stepped out for a walk and would return at any moment. The sitting room took William's breath away. It was like stepping into a private library that belonged in a university or museum. Books covered every available wall space, and several comfortable reading chairs were positioned strategically around the room with good lighting. But it was the desk that drew William's immediate attention. Spread across the mahogany surface were dozens of documents, photographs, letters, and what appeared to be research materials. At the center of it all was an old leather-bound journal, open to a page filled with Arthur's careful handwriting. William approached the desk cautiously, feeling almost like an intruder in this obviously private workspace. Kate had wandered over to examine the bookshelves and was running her finger along the spines of the volumes. "William," she called softly, "these books are incredible. Look at this. He has first editions of Dickens, original works by Darwin, and I think this might be a signed copy of something by Winston Churchill." But William was transfixed by what he was seeing on the desk. The open journal page contained what appeared to be a family tree, but not just any family tree. This was his family tree, meticulously researched and documented going back several generations. At the bottom of the page, in Arthur's neat script, was William's own name, along with his birth date and even Kate's name with their marriage date. His hands trembling slightly, William picked up one of the photographs from the desk. It was a black and white image of a young couple standing in front of what looked like the same cottage, but the photograph was clearly from decades earlier. The man in the picture bore a striking resemblance to William's father, but that was impossible. His father had always claimed never to have visited this place. "Kate," William called, his voice catching slightly, "I think you need to see this." She joined him at the desk, and together they began to examine the materials that Arthur had so carefully laid out. There were letters dated from just months. Ago, addressed to "My dear nephew William," though William was certain he had never received any correspondence from Arthur. There were photographs of people William didn't recognize, but who shared unmistakable family resemblances. And there were documents, official-looking papers with government seals and legal stamps. As Kate picked up one of the letters and began to read, her expression changed from curiosity to surprise to something approaching shock. "William," she said quietly, "I think your great-uncle was trying to tell you something very important." The cottage seemed to grow quieter around them, as William realized that this inheritance was not the simple bequest of an elderly relative's modest possessions. Arthur had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, and had left behind something that was going to change everything William thought he knew about his family and himself. Kate's hands shook as she held the first letter, her eyes scanning the elegant handwriting that filled the cream-colored paper. The date at the top showed it had been written only 6 months before Arthur's death, addressed to William with an intimacy that seemed impossible given they had never met. "My dear nephew William," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you are reading this, then I have finally found the courage to share the truth that I have carried for more than 50 years. I have watched you from afar, celebrated your achievements, worried during your struggles, and hoped that someday I would be able to explain why I stayed away from the family for so long." William sank into the leather chair behind the desk, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "Keep reading," he managed to say, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear what came next. Kate continued, "The falling out with your grandfather was not what the family believes. I did not leave because of money or property or any of the petty disagreements that families sometimes magnify over time. I left because I discovered something about our family history that your grandfather felt was too dangerous to acknowledge, something that he believed could destroy not just our family's reputation, but possibly put us all in genuine danger." The afternoon light streaming through the cottage windows suddenly seemed less warm, and William found himself glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. Kate moved closer to him, continuing to read from Arthur's letter. During My years as a historical researcher, I stumbled upon documents that revealed our family's involvement in events during the Second World War that were far more significant than anyone knew. Your great-grandfather, James Morrison, my father and your grandfather's father, was not simply a clerk for the government as we were always told. He was part of a highly classified operation that saved hundreds of lives, but also created enemies that persisted long after the war ended. William interrupted. That's impossible. Great-grandfather James died when I was very young, but everyone always said he was just an ordinary civil servant. He worked for the local council or something mundane like that. Kate looked up from the letter, her eyes wide with concern. There's more, William. Much more. She turned the page and continued reading. I have spent the last 40 years documenting everything I could find about James's real work during the war. He was part of a network that helped Jewish families escape from occupied Europe, but he also had access to intelligence that led to the capture of several high-ranking Nazi officials. Some of those officials had family members who swore revenge against everyone involved in their capture. The implications of what Kate was reading began to sink in, and William felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying that our family has been hiding from Nazi revenge seekers for decades? Let me finish the letter, Kate said, though her voice was trembling now. In 1952, James received credible threats against his family. Rather than go to the authorities, who he no longer trusted completely, he made the decision to scatter the family and destroy most evidence of his wartime activities. He told different family members different stories about why they needed to move, change their names, or cut contact with certain relatives. My part was to disappear completely and guard the evidence that proved what really happened. Kate set down the first letter and picked up another one, this one more recent. This one is dated just 3 months ago, she said. William, I am dying, and I know that my time to share this burden is running out. The men who threatened our family are long dead, but their sons and grandsons have continued the search. They have never stopped looking for James Morrison's descendants, and they have never stopped believing that our family possesses information or artifacts that could incriminate their relatives or lead to recovered war treasures. William stood up abruptly and began pacing around the room. This is insane, Kate. We're talking about things that happened 80 years ago. Why would anyone still care about any of this? Before Kate could answer, she noticed something that made her freeze. On the desk, partially hidden under other papers, was a more recent document. She pulled it out and saw that it was a newspaper clipping from just 2 months ago. The headline read, Local historian found dead in apparent break-in gone wrong. William, she said urgently, look at this. He stopped pacing and took the newspaper clipping from her hands. The article described how Arthur Morrison, described as a reclusive local historian, had been found dead in his cottage by a neighbor who had noticed that his daily walk routine had been interrupted. Police initially suspected a burglary because several rooms appeared to have been searched, but nothing of obvious value seemed to be missing. The police report says it was a heart attack brought on by the stress of the break-in. William read aloud. But Kate, look at this detail. They mention that whoever searched the house seemed to be looking for papers or documents specifically. They went through his desk, his filing cabinets, even his books, but they left behind valuable items like his watch, silver candlesticks, and a collection of antique coins. Kate picked up Arthur's journal and began flipping through the pages. What she found made her gasp audibly. The final entries, written in Arthur's increasingly shaky handwriting, told a story of growing paranoia and fear. Listen to this, she said, reading from an entry dated just weeks before Arthur's death. They found me. I don't know how, but someone has been watching the cottage. I've seen the same car parked on the lane 3 times this week, and yesterday, I found footprints in the garden near my study window. I've hidden the most important documents, but I'm afraid I may not have much time left. If something happens to me before William can get here, I pray that he will be smart enough to understand the danger and careful enough to protect himself and Kate. William felt the blood drain from his face. Kate, if Arthur was being watched, and if someone killed him looking for these documents, then they might still be watching the cottage. Kate finished his thought, her voice barely a whisper. They both turned to look toward the windows, suddenly acutely aware that they had been in the cottage for over an hour and that their car, with its London plates, was parked prominently in the driveway. If someone had been monitoring Arthur's cottage, they would certainly have noticed new visitors. William moved to the window and carefully peered out through the curtains. The lane appeared empty, but the cottage was surrounded by trees and hills that could easily conceal watchers. "We need to find whatever Arthur hid," he said decisively. "And we need to find it quickly." Kate had already returned to Arthur's journal and was scanning the final pages for clues. "Here," she said excitedly. "He mentions hiding something where James first taught him to read. And there's another reference to the place where the old stories come alive." "Those could be anywhere," William said, feeling frustrated. "We don't have time to search the entire cottage, especially if someone might be watching us." But Kate was studying the room more carefully now, looking for anything that might fit Arthur's cryptic clues. Her attention was drawn to one particular section of the bookshelf where the books seemed to be arranged differently from the rest. Instead of being organized by size or author, this section contained what appeared to be children's books and fairy tales. "William," she said, approaching the shelf, "what if where the old stories come alive refers to these children's books, and if James taught Arthur to read, maybe it was with these same books?" As Kate reached for one of the volumes, a book of Grimm's fairy tales that looked much older and more worn than the others, she noticed that it didn't slide out of the shelf normally. Instead, it seemed to be connected to some kind of mechanism. "It's not a real book," she said with growing excitement. "It's some kind of hidden compartment." With William looking over her shoulder, Kate carefully manipulated the false book, and they heard a soft clicking sound from somewhere behind the bookshelf. A section of the shelving swung inward slightly, revealing that it was actually a concealed door. "Arthur built a secret room," William breathed, hardly believing what he was seeing. As they pushed the hidden door open wider, they found themselves looking into a small, windowless chamber that Arthur had clearly been using as his most private workspace. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and documents. A single desk lamp illuminated stacks of files and what appeared to be several small wooden boxes. But it was what they saw on the far wall that made them both gasp in unison. Mounted there in a simple frame was a Nazi flag with a bullet hole. Through its center, and next to it, a collection of medals and commendations bearing great-grandfather James's name. The secret room felt like stepping into a wartime museum that had been frozen in time. Kate moved toward the wall of medals, while William examined the maps that covered nearly every surface. These weren't ordinary tourist maps, but detailed military. Charts with routes marked in different colored ink, dates written in margins, and small photographs pinned at various locations. "William, look at this," Kate called softly, pointing to one of the commendations. "This medal is from the French Resistance. It's awarded to your great-grandfather James Morrison for extraordinary courage in the liberation of civilian prisoners and the successful coordination of escape routes through occupied territory." William joined her at the wall, studying the collection of honors that told a story completely different from the family legend of their ancestor being a simple clerk. There were commendations from the British government, thank-you letters from families who had been saved, and photographs showing James with groups of people in what appeared to be safe houses or refugee camps. "Here's something else," William said, picking up a leather portfolio from Arthur's desk. Inside were copies of official documents, all bearing James Morrison's name and signature. "These are authorization papers for something called Operation Shepherd. It looks like James wasn't just helping people escape, he was one of the coordinators of the entire operation." Kate opened one of the wooden boxes and found it filled with small personal items, jewelry, photographs, letters, and other mementos. Each item had a small tag with a name and date. These must be belongings from the people James helped save, she realized. He kept them all these years, probably hoping to return them to families someday. As they continued exploring the hidden room, they began to understand the scope of what James had been involved in. The maps showed escape routes that stretched across multiple countries. The photographs depicted safe houses, resistance fighters, and dozens of families who had been rescued from concentration camps or hidden from Nazi search parties. But it was a thick file folder labeled post-war threats that explained why the family had been living in secrecy for decades. William opened it to find police reports, newspaper clippings, and handwritten letters that painted a picture of ongoing danger that had persisted long after the war ended. "Listen to this," William said, reading from a 1953 police report. James Morrison reported receiving threatening letters and noticed suspicious individuals watching his home. The threats specifically mentioned his role in Operation Shepherd and promised revenge against him and his family. Local police recommended that Morrison consider relocating and changing his identity for his own protection. Kate found another document that made her stomach turn. It was a letter from 1961, written in German but translated into English in Arthur's handwriting. The translation read, "James Morrison and his descendants will pay for the deaths they caused and the secrets they stole. We have been patient, but we do not forget. Every generation of his family will be found and made to answer for his crimes against the fatherland." "This is why Arthur stayed away from the family," William said, the pieces finally falling into place. He wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting all of us by keeping this knowledge isolated. But Kate had moved on to examining more recent documents, and what she found was even more disturbing. "William, these threats didn't stop in the 1960s. Look at this." She held up a file containing letters and documents from the 1990s and 2000s. Arthur continued receiving indirect threats and warnings throughout his life, and look at this news article from 2018. The article described the mysterious death of a historian in Germany who had been researching Nazi war crimes. The man had been found dead in his apartment after what appeared to be a break-in, but like Arthur's case, nothing valuable had been stolen. The article mentioned that the historian had been working on a book about Operation Shepherd and had been trying to track down surviving participants and their families. "They're still active," Kate whispered, the full horror of their situation beginning to dawn on her. "Whoever is behind this, they're still looking for people connected to Operation Shepherd." William set down the file and looked around the room with new eyes. Arthur wasn't just preserving family history in here, he was documenting an ongoing threat. But Kate, if these people killed Arthur to get this information, and if they're still watching the cottage— Before he could finish his thought, they heard a sound that made them both freeze. The unmistakable creak of the cottage's front door, opening. They had closed it behind them when they entered, and they were certain they had locked it. Someone else was now inside the cottage. Kate grabbed William's arm, her eyes wide with terror. They could hear footsteps moving slowly through the hallway, and whoever it was seemed to know their way around the house. The footsteps paused, and they heard the sound of papers being shuffled in the main sitting room. William quickly, but quietly, moved to close the secret door, but Kate stopped him. "If we close this completely, we'll be trapped in here," she whispered. "There's no other way out of this room." The footsteps were getting closer. Whoever was in the cottage was methodically checking each room, and it would only be a matter of minutes before they reached the sitting room where William and Kate were hidden. William looked around the secret room desperately, searching for anything that might help them. In the corner, he noticed a small wooden crate that looked different from the others. Opening it quickly, he found something that made his heart race. A handgun, obviously well-maintained, along with a box of ammunition and a note from Arthur. The note read, "William, if you are reading this in this room, then the danger I feared has found you. This weapon belonged to your great-grandfather James. He taught me to use it when I was young, hoping I would never need it. I pray you will never need it either, But if you do, remember that these people have been hunting our family for 80 years, and they will not stop simply because you ask them to." Kate saw the gun and shook her head frantically, but William was already checking to see if it was loaded. The footsteps had reached the sitting room, and they could hear someone moving around Arthur's desk, opening drawers and shuffling through papers. "They're looking for the same things we found," William breathed, barely audible. Through the crack in the secret door, they could see a tall man in dark clothing examining Arthur's journal. He appeared to be middle-aged, with graying hair and the kind of methodical movements that suggested he was familiar with searching through other people's belongings. He was not alone. They could hear at least one other person moving around in different parts of the cottage. The man at the desk began speaking in what sounded like German, calling out to his companion. While William and Kate couldn't understand the words, the tone was clearly frustrated. It seemed like the intruders were not finding what they were looking for in the main room. Kate pointed to something that made William's blood run cold. The man at the desk was now examining the bookshelf, running his hands along the spines of the books in the same section where Kate had discovered the hidden mechanism. It was only a matter of time before he found the concealed door. William made a decision that surprised even himself. Gripping the gun firmly but keeping it pointed safely downward, he pushed the secret door open wider and stepped out into the sitting room. "Looking for something?" he said, his voice much steadier than he felt. The man spun around, clearly startled to find that he was not alone in the cottage. He was younger than William had expected, probably in his 40s, with sharp features and cold blue eyes. When he spoke, his English was accented but perfectly clear. "Mr. Morrison," he said, as if he had been expecting this encounter, "you have saved us considerable time. We were hoping to complete our business here before you arrived, but perhaps this is better. We can discuss this situation like civilized people." "Discuss what situation?" William asked, keeping the gun visible but not directly threatening. Kate remained hidden in the secret room, but William could sense her presence behind the partially open door. The man smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. "The situation of your family's debt to history, Mr. Morrison. The situation of documents and artifacts that rightfully belong to families who were destroyed by your great-grandfather's interference in matters that did not concern him. My great-grandfather helped save people from concentration camps," William said firmly. "If that created enemies, then I'm proud to be his descendant." "Your great-grandfather," the man said, his voice becoming harder, "stole property, destroyed families, and caused the deaths of loyal soldiers who were simply following orders. He took things that did not belong to him, and his descendants have been keeping those things hidden for 80 years. William realized that this conversation was not going to end with a peaceful resolution. The man's companion appeared in the doorway behind him, a younger man, also armed, who was clearly there to make sure that William and anyone with him did not leave the cottage alive. "Where is your wife, Mr. Morrison?" the older man asked. "We know she came here with you. This will be much simpler if we can discuss this matter with both of you present." William's mind raced as he tried to process the situation. These men clearly knew more about his family than he did, and they had come prepared for confrontation. The younger man near the doorway had his hand resting on what was obviously a concealed weapon, while the older man continued to speak with an unsettling calm that suggested he had been in similar situations before. "My wife is not here," William lied, hoping to buy time and keep Kate hidden. "I came alone to see what my great-uncle had left behind." The older man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect. "Mr. Morrison, we have been watching this cottage for weeks. We saw you arrive with a woman. We saw you both enter together. Please do not insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." From behind the partially open secret door, Kate was listening to every word while frantically searching through Arthur's files for anything that might help them understand what these men were really after. Among the papers, she found a document that made her heart skip a beat. a list of numbered items with descriptions like gold jewelry, family Rosenberg, silver candlesticks, family Klein, and documents, Swiss bank account numbers. The truth hit her like a physical blow. These weren't just personal mementos that James had saved from rescued families. They were valuable items that families had given him to hide or safeguard, trusting that he would return them after the war ended. But the war had created chaos. Many of the families had been killed, and James had been left holding property that technically belonged to people who might no longer exist. Kate also found something else that changed everything. A recent letter addressed to Arthur from a legal firm in Switzerland. The letter, dated just 6 months before Arthur's death, informed him that a bank account associated with Operation Shepherd had been discovered during an audit. The account contained deposits made during the 1940s, totaling what would now be worth several $1,000,000. The bank was requesting documentation to prove rightful ownership of the funds. Understanding flooded through Kate as she realized what the intruders were really seeking. This wasn't about revenge or family honor. It was about money, millions of dollars that had been hidden for 80 years, waiting for someone to provide the correct documentation to claim it. In the main room, the older man had begun speaking again. Your great-grandfather was entrusted with certain valuables and financial instruments by families who believed they were going to die. Many of those families did die, Mr. Morrison, but some survived, and their descendants have been searching for what rightfully belongs to them. If that's true, William said, trying to keep his voice steady, then those items should be returned to the rightful owners through proper legal channels. You don't need to break into houses or threaten people to accomplish that. The younger man near the door laughed harshly and spoke for the first time. Legal channels? He said in accented English. Do you think the Swiss banks care about legal channels when millions of dollars are involved? Do you think lawyers care about the rightful owners when they can claim those funds for themselves? The older man shot his companion a warning look, clearly feeling that too much information was being shared. What my colleague means, he said smoothly, is that this situation requires a more direct approach. We need the documentation that proves the chain of custody for certain items. We know your great-uncle Arthur had been collecting and preserving those documents for decades. William glanced toward the secret room, hoping that Kate was finding answers in Arthur's files. Even if such documents exist, I wouldn't know where to find them. I never even met Arthur, and this is the first time I've been in this cottage. But you have been exploring quite thoroughly since you arrived, the older man observed, and you seem to have found some interesting reading material. He gestured toward Arthur's journal, which was still open on the desk. Behind the hidden door, Kate had made a discovery that both terrified and amazed her. Arthur had not just been preserving random documents. He had been meticulously tracking down the surviving family members of everyone James had helped during the war. For decades, Arthur had been quietly returning items to rightful owners or their descendants when he could locate them. But there was more. Arthur had also been working with international law enforcement to identify and prosecute people who were using claims about missing war assets to commit fraud or extortion. The men in the cottage were not representing legitimate family claims. They were part of a criminal organization that had been targeting anyone connected to wartime rescue operations. Kate found copies of emails between Arthur and investigators from Scotland Yard, Interpol, and the FBI. The investigators had been building cases against what they called inheritance scammers, who posed as descendants of Holocaust victims to claim assets that had been hidden during the war. Arthur had been serving as a confidential informant, providing documentation that helped law enforcement distinguish between legitimate claims and fraudulent ones. The final piece of the puzzle was in Arthur's last letter to William, which Kate had not had time to read completely earlier. Arthur had written, "The men who have been threatening our family are not seeking justice for war crimes. They are criminals who have learned that our family's connection to Operation Shepherd makes us valuable targets. They believe we have access to Swiss bank accounts and hidden assets that they can steal if they can force us to provide the right documentation. Kate realized that she needed to get this information to William somehow, but she could hear that. The conversation in the main room was becoming more heated. The younger man was growing impatient, and she heard him say something about wasting time with conversation. Making a decision that surprised her with its boldness, Kate quietly opened one of the wooden boxes Arthur had stored in the secret room. Inside, she found something that Arthur had obviously placed there for exactly this situation, a small recording device with a note that read, "Evidence for police. Activate if threatened." She pressed the record button and then, taking a deep breath, stepped out of the secret room to join William. "Gentlemen," she announced, causing both intruders to spin toward her in surprise. "I think there's something you need to know about the people you're working for." The older man recovered from his surprise quickly, but Kate could see calculation in his eyes as he reassessed the situation. "Mrs. Morrison, how delightful that you could join us. I trust you have been finding your husband's family history educational." "Very educational," Kate replied, holding up some of Arthur's documents. "Educational enough to know that you're not here representing Holocaust survivors or their families. You're here representing criminals who have been using other people's tragedy to steal money." The younger man moved closer to William, his hand now openly resting on his weapon. "Enough talking," he said harshly. "We need those documents, and we need access to the Swiss account information. You can give them to us willingly, or we can search for them after you are no longer able to interfere." William raised Arthur's gun, pointing it directly at the older man. "I think you need to leave now, Mr. Morrison," the older man said calmly. "Do you really think you are prepared to shoot someone? Do you think your wife is prepared to watch you kill a man, or to watch you die when my colleague responds to your threat?" Kate stepped closer to William, and together they began backing toward the cottage's front door. "We don't need to shoot anyone," Kate said firmly. "We just need you to understand that we know who you really are, and we have evidence of your criminal activities. Evidence that is already in the hands of law enforcement." This was a bluff, but Kate delivered it with such conviction that both intruders hesitated. The older man's eyes narrowed as he studied Kate's face, trying to determine if she was lying. "What evidence?" he demanded. Kate held up the recording device, which had been running throughout their conversation. "Evidence that you just confessed to extortion, theft, and threatening innocent people. Evidence that proves you are not legitimate representatives of Holocaust survivors, but criminals who are exploiting their memory for profit." The younger man cursed in German and started to draw his weapon, but the older man held up a hand to stop him. "This changes nothing," he said to William and Kate. "Even if you have recorded our conversation, you still have something that belongs to our clients. Those documents and account access codes will be retrieved, whether you cooperate now or whether we return later with more persuasive methods." William and Kate had reached the front door, and William fumbled behind him to turn the handle while keeping the gun pointed at the intruders. "Your clients are criminals," he said firmly, "and these documents are evidence in ongoing criminal investigations. If you want them, you'll have to go through the police." As they backed out of the cottage, Kate noticed something that made her heart sink. Parked at the end of the lane, partially hidden behind trees, was a dark sedan with at least 2 more people inside. Even if William and Kate managed to reach their car, they would not be able to simply drive away from this situation. The older man followed them to the doorway, but did not pursue them outside. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," he called after them, "you have 48 hours to reconsider your position. After that, this matter will be resolved through less pleasant methods. We know where you live, we know where you work, and we know that you cannot hide from us any more successfully than Arthur did." William and Kate reached their car as quickly as they dared, trying not to appear panicked while acutely aware that they were being watched from multiple directions. William's hands shook as he started the engine, and Kate clutched the recording device and Arthur's documents against her chest like a lifeline. "Drive normally," Kate whispered, though her voice was tight with fear. "Don't let them think we're running." As they pulled away from the cottage, William glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the dark sedan beginning to follow them at a distance. The older man stood in the cottage doorway, speaking into a mobile phone, his posture suggesting he was giving instructions to others. "Kate, we can't go back to London," William said as they reached the main road. "If they know where we live and work, going home would be walking into a trap." Kate was already thinking ahead, trying to remember everything she had learned from Arthur's files. "We need to get to the police, but not the local police. Arthur was working with Scotland Yard and international investigators. We need to find Detective Inspector Sarah Chen. She was Arthur's primary contact according to his emails." "How do we contact her without using our phones?" William asked. "If these people are as organized as they seem, they might be monitoring our communications." Kate remembered seeing something in Arthur's secret room that might help. Arthur had a mobile phone hidden in his desk, an older model that probably isn't connected to any accounts they would know about. "We need to go back and get it." "Go back?" William said incredulously. "Kate, those men are still there, and they made it clear that they're not going to let us just walk away from this." "Then we wait until they leave," Kate said firmly. "William, think about what we learned in that room. Arthur spent 40 years documenting everything about these criminals. He was building a case that could put them in prison and return stolen assets to legitimate families. If we don't follow through on his work, then he died for nothing." William drove in silence for several minutes, checking his mirrors constantly to monitor the sedan that continued following them. Finally, he pulled into a small car park near a village pub, hoping that the public location would provide some safety. "What exactly did you find in those files?" he asked Kate. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like we stumbled into something much bigger than a family inheritance." Kate spread some of Arthur's documents across her lap, organizing them so she could explain what she had discovered. "Arthur wasn't just hiding from threats, William. He was actively working to expose an international criminal network. These people don't just target families connected to Operation Shepherd. They target anyone who might have access to assets hidden during the war." She showed him copies of police reports from multiple countries. "Look at this. Similar break-ins and deaths in France, Germany, the United States, and Canada, all targeting elderly people who had connections to wartime rescue operations or resistance activities. In every case, nothing obviously valuable was stolen, but documents and papers were taken." William studied the reports, beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. "So these aren't isolated incidents. This is organized crime on an international scale." "Exactly," Kate confirmed. "And Arthur was one of the key witnesses helping law enforcement track them down. That's why they killed him, and that's why they're so desperate to get his files. Those documents don't just contain information about hidden assets. They contain evidence that could destroy their entire operation." The dark sedan had parked across the street from the pub, and William could see at least 2 people inside watching them. "We can't stay here," he said, "but we also can't keep driving around indefinitely. These people clearly have resources and patience." Kate had been thinking about their options, and she had an idea that was risky, but might work. "William, what if we don't try to hide from them? What if we use the fact that they need us alive to our advantage?" "What do you mean?" "They need Arthur's documents and access codes to claim those Swiss bank accounts. Without us, they have nothing. So instead of running away, what if we arrange to meet them somewhere public, somewhere with security cameras and witnesses, and we make the exchange?" William stared at her. "Kate, we don't actually have access codes to any bank accounts. And even if we did, we'd be helping criminals steal money." "We don't give them real access codes," Kate explained. "We give them fake ones, but in a location where police can arrest them when they try to use the information. Arthur's files include contact information for the Swiss bank investigators. We call them, explain the situation, and set up a sting operation. It was a dangerous plan, but as William thought about it, he realized it might be their only chance to end this situation safely. How do we contact the Swiss investigators without these criminals knowing what we're doing? Kate held up Arthur's hidden mobile phone, which she had managed to grab during their escape from the cottage. Arthur had all the contact numbers programmed into this phone. We called Detective Inspector Chen first, explain everything, and let law enforcement coordinate the international response. They sat in the car park for another hour, watching their watchers and refining their plan. Kate used Arthur's phone to call Scotland Yard, and after being transferred several times, she finally reached Detective Inspector Sarah Chen. "Mrs. Morrison," Chen said after Kate had explained who she was. "Arthur Morrison was a valuable asset to our investigation. We've been expecting contact from his family since his death. Are you somewhere safe?" "Not exactly," Kate admitted, and she quickly outlined their current situation. Chen listened without interrupting, and when Kate finished, the detective's response was immediate and decisive. "Mrs. Morrison, you and your husband are in serious danger. The organization you've encountered has killed at least 6 people across 4 countries in the past 2 years. We need to get you to safety immediately." "What about the evidence, Arthur?" "Collected?" Kate asked. "And what about stopping these people?" "The evidence is crucial," Chen agreed, "but not more crucial than your lives. Can you tell me exactly where you are right now?" Kate gave Chen their location, and the detective promised that local police would arrive within 30 minutes to provide protection. "In the meantime," Chen instructed, "stay in public view, don't try to return to the cottage, and don't attempt to confront these criminals again." But as Kate ended the call, she and William watched the dark sedan across the street begin moving. Instead of leaving, however, it was joined by a second vehicle, and both cars positioned themselves to block the car park exits. "They're not going to wait for us to contact law enforcement," William realized. "They're going to force a confrontation. Right here." Kate looked around the car park desperately. There were a few other vehicles, but no people visible outside the pub. If the criminals decided to approach them now, there would be little to stop them from taking whatever they wanted. By force. "William," Kate said urgently, "we need to get inside the pub around other people, and we need to do it now." As they opened their car doors, the men from both sedans began walking toward them. William recognized the older man from the cottage, but the others were new faces, all wearing dark clothing and moving with the coordinated precision of people who had worked together before. Kate grabbed Arthur's documents and the recording device, while William kept Arthur's gun concealed but accessible. They hurried toward the pub entrance, hoping to reach safety before the approaching men could stop them. But as they neared the pub door, Kate realized something that made her blood run cold. Through the windows, she could see that the pub was nearly empty, except for an elderly bartender and 1 customer. If the criminals were willing to act in broad daylight in a car park, they probably wouldn't hesitate to continue their confrontation inside a nearly deserted building. "Kate," William said urgently, "they're not going to let us just walk away from this. These people have killed before, and they're not going to risk leaving witnesses who can identify them." The older man called out to them as they reached the pub entrance. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, there's no need to involve innocent people in this matter. Come back to your car and we can resolve this situation quickly and quietly." Kate made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of entering the pub, she turned to face the approaching men and held up Arthur's recording device. "Everyone stop right there," she called out loudly enough for anyone inside the pub to hear. "I'm recording everything that happens here, and this recording is being transmitted directly to Scotland Yard. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen is already aware of our situation, and police are on their way." This was partially a bluff. The recording device was not actually transmitting anything, but Kate delivered it with such authority that the approaching men hesitated. The older man's expression changed from confident to calculating as he reassessed the situation. If police were indeed coming and if their conversation was being recorded, continuing the confrontation could expose their entire operation. "Mrs. Morrison," he said carefully, "I think there has been a misunderstanding about our intentions here." But before he could continue, the sound of sirens became audible in the distance, growing steadily louder. Detective Inspector Chen had been true to her word about dispatching local police quickly. The criminals heard the sirens too, and William watched as they quickly but calmly returned to their vehicles. They were clearly experienced at avoiding law enforcement and had no intention of being caught at the scene when police arrived. As the first police car pulled into the car park, Kate felt her legs go weak with relief. They had survived the immediate threat, but she knew that their ordeal was far from over. The criminals had made it clear that they knew where William and Kate lived, and they had demonstrated that they were willing to kill to get what they wanted. The question now was whether law enforcement would be able to use Arthur's evidence to stop them permanently, or whether William and Kate would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next confrontation. 3. Months later, William and Kate sat in a secure conference room at Scotland Yard, watching Detective Inspector Sarah Chen organize stacks of evidence that had grown substantially since their terrifying encounter at the village pub. The past 12 weeks had been a whirlwind of police interviews, safe house relocations, and international coordination that had revealed the true scope of Arthur's 40-year investigation. "The operation was even larger than Arthur realized," Chen explained, spreading photographs across the table. "Using the evidence you recovered from his cottage, along with information from his contacts in 6 different countries, we've identified a criminal network that was operating on 3 continents." Kate picked up one of the photographs, which showed the older man who had confronted them at the cottage. "Have you arrested him?" "Klaus Weber was arrested in Geneva 2 weeks ago," Chen confirmed. "He was attempting to access a Swiss bank account using forged documents that closely matched the ones he was trying to steal from you. The Swiss authorities had been monitoring that particular account since Arthur first contacted them about suspicious activity." William studied a chart that showed connections between dozens of individuals across multiple countries. "How many people were involved in this?" "The core organization included about 30 active criminals," Chen said. "But they had been exploiting the stories of hundreds of legitimate Holocaust survivors and their families. They would research real wartime experiences, create false documentation claiming to represent survivors or their descendants, and then target anyone who might have access to hidden assets or information." Kate found herself staring at photographs of elderly people who looked remarkably similar to Arthur, historians, researchers, and family members who had been murdered or died under suspicious circumstances. "All of these people were killed by the same organization?" Chen nodded grimly. 17 confirmed murders across 8 countries, all targeting people who had connections to wartime rescue operations or resistance activities. Arthur wasn't the first, and if we hadn't stopped them, he wouldn't have been the last. The detective picked up a thick folder labeled Operation Shepherd, Final Report, and handed it to William. "Your great-grandfather's wartime activities were even more significant than Arthur knew. The documents you recovered helped us piece together the complete story of what James Morrison accomplished during the war." William opened the folder to find maps, photographs, and testimonials that painted a picture of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. James Morrison had indeed been instrumental in saving hundreds of lives, but he had also been responsible for gathering intelligence that led to the capture of war criminals and the recovery of millions of dollars worth of stolen art and assets. The Swiss bank accounts that the criminals were trying to access contained funds that were supposed to be returned to surviving families, Chen explained. James had been holding that money in trust, waiting for the war to end so he could locate the rightful owners. When he died, Arthur inherited both the responsibility and the danger that came with protecting those assets. Kate discovered something in the folder that brought tears to her eyes. It was a letter written by James Morrison shortly before his death, addressed to whoever inherits this burden. In the letter, James explained that he had spent his final years tracking down survivors and their families, quietly returning money and possessions whenever possible. He never kept any of it for himself, Kate said softly. Even when his own family was struggling financially, he was using his own money to hire investigators and lawyers to find the people these assets belonged to. That's correct, Chen confirmed. And Arthur continued that work. Over the past 40 years, he successfully returned over $12 million worth of assets to legitimate families. The criminals who threatened you were trying to steal money that had already been designated for return to Holocaust survivors and their descendants. William looked up from reading testimonials from families who had been helped by his great-grandfather and great-uncle. What happens now? Are Kate and I still in danger? Chen smiled for the first time since they had met her. The last members of the organization were arrested yesterday in Montreal. Klaus Weber has agreed to testify against his associates in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the Swiss authorities have recovered all of the stolen funds. You're safe. But Kate had noticed something else in the folder that surprised her. There's a letter here addressed to me and William, dated just 2 weeks before Arthur died. Chen nodded. Arthur suspected that he was running out of time. He wrote that letter as instructions for you, hoping that if something happened to him, you would be able to complete the work he had started. Kate opened the letter with trembling hands and began reading aloud. My dear William and Kate, if you are reading this, then I have failed to protect myself but succeeded in protecting the evidence that will bring these criminals to justice. I have watched you both from afar for many years, and I believe you have the courage and integrity needed to finish what your great-grandfather started. The letter continued with specific instructions about contacting law enforcement, detailed explanations of Arthur's filing system, and most importantly, information about a final group of families who were still waiting to be reunited with assets that rightfully belonged to them. There are still families out there who don't know that money and property belonging to their relatives is waiting for them, William realized. Exactly, Chen said. With the criminal organization dismantled, we can now safely complete the process of returning these assets, but we need your help to do it properly. Kate and William exchanged glances, both understanding that they were being asked to continue a mission that had defined 2 generations of their family. It was dangerous work that had already cost Arthur his life, but it was also deeply meaningful, work that had brought justice and closure to hundreds of families. What would we need to do? Kate asked. Chen explained that the process would involve working with international law enforcement, Holocaust memorial organizations, and genealogy researchers to identify surviving family members and verify their claims. It would be time-consuming and emotionally difficult work, but it would also be the completion of something that James Morrison had started more than 80 years earlier. You don't have to decide immediately, Chen said gently. But I want you to know that Arthur's cottage and all of his research materials are now officially yours, with no legal complications. The evidence has been cataloged for the criminal cases, but the historical materials and family documents belong to you. William thought about the secret room behind the bookshelf, filled with maps and photographs and stories of extraordinary courage. He thought about his great-grandfather, James, who had risked everything to save people he had never met. And he thought about Arthur, who had spent 40 years in isolation, protecting both his family and the evidence that would eventually bring criminals to justice. Kate, he said quietly, what do you think? Kate was looking at a photograph that showed James Morrison with a group of children who had been rescued from a concentration camp. The children's faces were filled with hope and gratitude, and Kate could see a clear family resemblance between James and William. I think, she said, slowly, that some family legacies are worth preserving. Detective Inspector Chen smiled as she watched William and Kate examining the evidence that represented decades of careful documentation and investigation. There's one more thing, she said, pulling out a final folder. We've been able to identify 12 families who are still alive and waiting to learn what happened to relatives who disappeared during the war. Your great-grandfather kept detailed records about people he helped, and Arthur continued tracking their descendants. Kate opened the folder to find recent photographs and addresses of people living in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Israel. These were children and grandchildren of people whom James Morrison had saved. People who had been wondering for decades what had happened to family members who had vanished during the chaos of war. They've been looking for their families, William said, understanding immediately. And we have the information that can reunite them with their history. More than that, Chen said. Some of them have been looking for each other. Your great-grandfather's records show connections between families that were separated during rescue operations. Brothers and sisters, parents and children who have been living in different countries for 80 years, not knowing that their relatives survived. Kate felt tears starting in her eyes as she realized the full impact of what they were being offered. We could help reunite families. You could help complete one of the most successful rescue operations in history, Chen confirmed. James Morrison didn't just save lives during the war. He preserved the information that could restore families that were broken by that war. William looked at Kate, and in her expression, he saw the same determination that must have driven his great-grandfather and great-uncle. They had inherited more than just a cottage and some old documents. They had inherited a mission that was far from complete. "When do we start?" he asked. As they left Scotland Yard that afternoon, William and Kate walked hand in hand through the streets of London, carrying briefcases full of documents that represented 80 years of hidden history. They were no longer running from danger or hiding from threats. Instead, they were walking toward a future where they could honor their family's legacy by completing the work that had been started in the darkest days of human history. The cottage in Millbrook was waiting for them, with its secret room and hidden treasures, ready to become not just a repository of the past, but a foundation for healing that would reach across continents and generations. William had opened a door that day 3 months ago, and what he had found had indeed left both him and Kate in tears, but they were tears of pride, purpose, and hope for the future.